Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. Last Christmas, my name was erased from my own family. My daughter-in-law sent a message from Madrid with my husband and my only son beside her, telling me it was just the ones who really matter. In that moment, every memory I had built for 4 decades, Christmas mornings, church pews, pies cooling on my counter, shattered. But what they didn't know was that the woman they abandoned held every key to our fortune. Days later, as their cards were declined and panic set in, I had already locked away $1.2 million that carried only my name. They thought I was powerless. They were wrong. I sat in my living room that Christmas night, the lights on the tree blinking softly against the window, the smell of pine still faint in the air. The house was silent in a way that pressed down on me heavier than it had in years. I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for it to buzz with a message or a call, some sign that my family was thinking of me. By evening, the silence had stretched so long, it began to feel intentional. I finally opened my contacts and tapped on Mia's name. I typed a simple message, keeping my words careful. Hi, Mia. I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas. I just wanted to check where we're spending the holidays. Should I prepare anything for New Year's? My finger hovered for a moment before I pressed send, my chest tight with unease. The reply came faster than I expected, the screen lighting up almost instantly. Oops, we forgot to tell you. We're in Madrid. Just me, Daniel, and Tom. Only the ones who really matter. I stared at the glowing letters, my breath caught in my throat. My husband, Tom, the man I had been married to for more than 4 decades, my son Daniel, my only child, and Mia, my daughter-in-law, had gone to Spain together. Without me. The words, only the ones who really matter, cut deeper than any insult I had ever heard. I sat frozen in my chair, the Christmas lights blurred as tears filled my eyes. The warmth of every holiday memory I had cherished turned to ice in an instant. I saw Daniel as a boy running down these very stairs in his pajamas, his arms full of wrapping paper. I remembered Tom holding my hand in the church on Christmas Eve, whispering about how lucky we were. Those images clashed violently with the thought of them now smiling together on a trip across the ocean while I sat abandoned at home. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. I set it on the table, palms flat against the wood, trying to steady myself. It felt like the walls were closing in. For a moment, I even wondered if I had misunderstood, if there was some mistake, but the words were still there, sharp and deliberate. Only the ones who really matter. I stood slowly and walked into the kitchen, each step unsteady. The counters were bare except for the pie dish I had baked 2 days before, untouched. I had expected Daniel and Mia to drop by even just for a few minutes, and I had wanted something sweet for us to share. Now the pie sat, hardened crust cracked, a quiet symbol of my foolish hope. I poured myself a glass of water, but my hands trembled too much, and I set it back down untouched. My mind replayed the weeks leading up to this night. Tom had said he might be busy with year-end meetings, brushing off my questions about Christmas plans. Daniel had been vague on the phone, always cutting the conversation short. Mia had barely spoken to me at Thanksgiving, her smile smug, her tone clipped. Had they been planning this all along, laughing behind my back as they erased me from their lives? I leaned against the counter, my breathing uneven. The loneliness was sharp, but beneath it, something else stirred, something steadier and colder. Anger. It was not the fiery outburst that burned and vanished. It was slow, heavy building in my chest, with every memory of their casual dismissals. I walked back to the living room, my eyes falling on the stockings hanging by the fireplace. I had hung them out of habit, even though no one had helped decorate this year. Tom's stocking, Daniel's, and yes, even Mia's all lined up beside mine. The sight of them made my stomach turn. I picked up my phone again, scrolling through old messages. Weeks of short answers from Daniel. A handful of perfunctory notes from Tom, excuses about work and fatigue. Almost nothing from Mia except for the occasional reminder about Daniel's schedule or a dismissive comment about me forgetting something. Now it all made sense. The distance, the deflections, the pitying smiles. It was a campaign slow and deliberate to push me aside. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room. It was nearly midnight. Outside, the neighborhood was dark except for the occasional glimmer of holiday lights. I sat down on the couch, pressing a pillow to my chest, and let the tears come. They slid hot down my cheeks, but even as I cried, I felt the anger steadying me. They had gone to Spain, the three of them, and left me here like I did not matter. They had written me out of their plans and thought I would simply fade into the background. But as I sat in that silence, one truth settled deep inside me. They had underestimated me. I looked around the house, the walls painted with colors I had chosen, the furniture I had saved for the mortgage I had paid off with my own money. Every piece of it reminded me that this life, this home, had been built with my hands as much as theirs, maybe more. Without me, they would have had none of it. The tree lights blinked, casting shadows across the room, and I found myself sitting straighter, my tears drying. The hurt was still raw, but the cold resolve forming beneath it was stronger. They thought I was irrelevant. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. I turned off the tree lights, letting the room fall into darkness, and went upstairs to my bedroom. The bed felt larger than ever, the other side empty, but I did not feel as weak as I had an hour ago. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions and possibilities. Sleep did not come, but clarity did. Christmas had been stolen from me, but this would not end with me forgotten. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Tom, Daniel, and Mia were probably sitting down to a lavish dinner, sipping wine and congratulating themselves. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, my eyes burning in the dark. They could have their night. Mine was just beginning. I remembered Thanksgiving just a few weeks earlier, the smell of roasted turkey still fresh in my mind, the table set with the same china I had used every year since Daniel was a child. We were all seated together, and I had tried to share a story about the year we bought our house, how proud Tom had been when we finally signed the papers. Before I could finish, Mia cut in with a sharp laugh and said, "Maybe you are mixing things up, Grace. I think that was years later." The room fell silent. Daniel shifted in his chair, and instead of defending me, he simply looked down at his plate. I felt small in that moment, like my memories no longer mattered, like my voice had been reduced to background noise in my own home. After dinner, I went to the kitchen to start cleaning up, expecting Daniel to follow me like he always used to. For years, he would stand at the sink beside me drying dishes and telling me about his students, the little victories and frustrations of his work. That evening, he never came. I peeked into the living room and saw him sitting on the couch next to Mia, the two of them talking in low voices while Tom nodded along. When I walked in with a pot of coffee, the conversation stopped abruptly. Mia smiled sweetly and said we were just talking about the weather, as if the three of them had been plotting some secret. My heart sank, but I forced a smile and poured the coffee anyway. In the weeks that followed, Mia found subtle ways to chip at me. She would tilt her head and ask if I was feeling tired lately. Maybe I should look into one of those medical alert systems you never know at your age. She would pat my hand with that insincere smile, the kind people use when they want you to feel old and fragile. I was only 67, healthy, independent, but her words wormed into my thoughts late at night. I began to wonder if they were whispering behind my back about me losing my sharpness. One afternoon, I had been excited about planning our 45th wedding anniversary. I mentioned to Tom that I thought we could invite Daniel and Mia to our favorite restaurant downtown, the one with the piano player who always remembered Tom's requests. I could see Tom hesitate, his eyes flickering toward Mia. Before he could answer, Mia leaned forward and said in that syrupy tone she used when she was delivering a blow, "Oh, Grace, I think a quiet evening at home would be better for you. All that excitement might be too much." She had spoken as if Tom had already agreed, as if I were not even part of the decision. I looked at Tom, waiting for him to correct her, to say no. Grace deserves a celebration. He said nothing, just sipped his coffee, and the conversation died right there at my own kitchen table. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe I was being oversensitive, maybe they meant well. But the unease kept growing. Each little slight piled on top of the last until they formed a wall that separated me from my own family. Even Daniel, my son, who once used to call me every week, had grown distant. His calls became shorter, filled with vague answers. Whenever I asked about visiting or making plans, he said they were busy, and Mia's voice always lingered in the background, guiding the conversation. One evening, I called Daniel just to ask about his work at the high school. He answered quickly, sounding distracted, and when I pressed for details, he mumbled something about lesson planning. Then I heard Mia's voice faintly saying, "Tell her we are heading out." Daniel repeated it as if it were his own words. "Sorry, Mom. We are heading out, talk later." He hung up before I could even say goodnight. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, the dial tone ringing in my ears, realizing how easily she had begun to speak for him. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. At Thanksgiving, when she corrected me in front of everyone. During casual conversations, when she planted the idea that I was getting forgetful. In our anniversary plans, when she decided for me what I could handle. Even in the simple act of Daniel drying dishes with me, a tradition that suddenly vanished without a word. They were drawing lines, shrinking my role, making sure I felt less necessary, less included. I thought about the swing set still standing in the backyard, its paint chipped but sturdy, the one Daniel had played on for hours when he was little. I had left it there all these years, as a reminder of the boy who once looked at me like I was the center of his world. Now, he could not even look me in the eye when Mia belittled me. The realization pressed down on me as heavily as the silence of that Christmas night. These moments were not isolated. They were part of something bigger, a pattern I had ignored because it was easier to hope for the best. Now the pattern was clear. I was being pushed out one subtle step at a time. I walked upstairs and opened the drawer where I kept family photos. There was one of Daniel at 5 years old, grinning with a missing front tooth, and another of Tom kissing me under mistletoe. I held them in my lap, my chest aching, and I whispered to myself that I had not imagined it all. I had been loved once. I had mattered. The way they treated me now was not because I had lost my worth, it was because they had chosen to strip it from me. The anger returned colder than before, steadier. If Mia thought she could rewrite my place in this family, she was mistaken. I put the photos back carefully, closed the drawer, and straightened my shoulders. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. They had been building a life without me in it, and they had expected me to accept it quietly. I would not. I turned off the light, the house sinking into darkness, and stood at the window looking out over the snow-covered yard. The moonlight glowed against the swing set, casting long shadows across the ground. I stayed there for a long time, letting the truth settle deep in my bones. They had started cutting me out months ago, and I had let it happen. That ended tonight. The next morning, I woke with a pounding in my chest and a restless urgency that would not let me sit still. The house felt too quiet, too hollow, and every corner seemed to whisper that something was being hidden from me. I walked down the hallway and paused outside Tom's study. He always kept the door half shut, and I rarely entered unless he asked me to bring him something. That morning I pushed it open, the hinges creaking softly in the silence. The room smelled faintly of tobacco from the pipe he used on winter evenings. His leather chair sat pushed back from the desk, a pile of papers scattered across the surface. At first glance, everything looked ordinary, the same shelves of binders and framed certificates from his accounting days. But something pulled at me, a tug in my gut that told me to look closer. On the desk lay a folder, its corner tucked under a ledger. I pulled it free and opened it. My hands froze when I saw the header. Flight confirmation. I flipped the page and read the details. Chicago to Madrid, connection to Barcelona. 3 passengers, December 23rd, departure. The names printed clearly: Thomas Miller, Daniel, Miller, Mia, Carter. My own name was nowhere. A chill spread through my body as I lowered the paper. I sat heavily in his chair, staring at the confirmation, my fingers pressing into the armrest until they hurt. The paper trembled in my hand, proof of everything I had feared. They had planned this trip for weeks, maybe months, and not only left me behind, but erased me completely from their plans. I stood quickly, my pulse hammering, and opened the drawers. Receipts and notes spilled out, but one caught my eye in the trash bin beside the desk. I reached down and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a hotel receipt prepaid reservation for a 5-night stay at a 4-star hotel in Madrid. I smoothed it against the desk, the ink smudged but legible. The check-in date was December 24th. I looked up at the calendar hanging on the wall above the desk. Tom always kept it updated with appointments and reminders. The week of Christmas had been blank when I looked earlier this month, but now I saw faint smudges, traces of writing that had been erased. My stomach twisted as I leaned closer. The outlines of letters were still visible like ghosts, refusing to disappear. All at once the excuses flooded back. The late nights, the supposed client meetings, the vague phone calls. I could hear his voice in my memory, soft and casual, saying he was just catching up on some files. I could picture Daniel's distracted answers whenever I asked about holiday plans. I could see Mia's smirk at Thanksgiving, the glint in her eyes when she told me some families know how to prioritize what is important. The weight of betrayal settled hard on my chest. I ran my hand across the desk, touching the pens, the stapler, the framed photo of us on our 25th anniversary trip to Niagara Falls. I had chosen the frame myself with gold edging to match our rings. Now it felt like a cruel joke. 43 years of marriage, and he had looked me in the eyes just days ago and told me he had meetings, told me not to worry, told me everything was fine. He had kissed my cheek before leaving, the same gesture he had made for decades, and behind it all was a lie. I sank back into the chair, the one I had bought for his 60th birthday, the leather worn smooth from his use. The walls around me were lined with the history of our life. Books we had chosen together, pictures from trips we had saved for awards from the firm where I had worked beside him for 30 years before retiring. Every object was a testament to a shared life, and yet here I sat, realizing that to him it had meant so little he could throw it away for a secret holiday with our son and his wife. My hands pressed against my face, tears slipping between my fingers. The room blurred. My breath came ragged, and for a moment I felt like the floor would give out beneath me. Then something shifted. The tears slowed, and a different clarity cut through the haze. The papers in front of me were not just evidence of a betrayal. They were evidence of a plan, something deliberate and cruel. They had not simply forgotten me, they had erased me. And if they could do that for Christmas, what else were they planning to erase? I folded the flight confirmation and the hotel receipt, carefully slipping them into my sweater pocket. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stood looking around the room once more. It felt smaller now, stripped of comfort. This was no longer a place of trust. As I left the study and closed the door behind me, I knew the foundation of my marriage had cracked. The home I thought was built on loyalty and partnership was built on a lie I had been too trusting to see. I walked back through the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the hard wood, and the silence of the house pressed heavier than ever. In the kitchen, I poured myself a cup of coffee, the bitter taste sharp on my tongue. I sat at the table staring at the documents I had pulled out my mind, replaying every sign I had ignored. The world I thought I knew had shifted under my feet. When I finally stood to put the cup in the sink, my reflection in the window caught my eye. I hardly recognized the woman staring back. She looked older, smaller, but her eyes held a fire that had not been there before. I pressed my palm against the glass, steadying myself. The evidence was clear now. This was not carelessness. This was betrayal. And it was only the beginning. The next day, I woke before the sun, restless, and wired the documents from Tom's study still folded tightly in my nightstand drawer. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the darkened window, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. For years, I had been the one who quietly handled our accounts, balanced our budget, and made sure bills were paid. It was part of who I was, steady and responsible. Now those same skills would be my shield. I went to the kitchen, poured myself coffee, and stared at my phone for a long time before finally pressing Ben Lee's number. Ben had been our financial advisor for more than a decade, a man who had always been polite but professional. When his voice answered, warm and cautious, I felt my throat tighten. "Ben, it's Grace Miller. I need to see you today, if at all possible." There was a pause on the line. "Grace, of course. Are you all right?" "No. I want to come in. Something has come up and I need to review all of my accounts." His voice softened. "Come by the office at 10. We'll go through everything together." The call ended and I sat at the table, gripping my mug, the heat biting into my palms. 3 hours later, I was sitting in his downtown office, staring at the polished wood desk as Ben adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Grace, I need to be honest with you. 3 weeks ago, Tom came to see me. He asked about transferring some of your assets into joint accounts with Daniel. He said you had been showing some memory issues, and he wanted to make sure things were handled smoothly." The words hit me like a blow. Memory issues. That was the excuse. That was the story Mia had been building for months with her little digs about me being forgetful. My face burned, but my voice stayed steady. "What exactly did he ask for, Ben?" Ben pulled a folder from his drawer, flipping it open. He wanted to know about moving funds from your IRA and brokerage accounts. He also asked about adding Daniel to your CDs as a co-owner, but nothing was processed. I told him we would need your direct authorization. I nodded slowly, my fingers clenching the armrest of the chair. Show me everything, Ben. Every account, every investment, every certificate, every deed. I want to see exactly what is mine. For the next hour, he walked me through page after page. I listened carefully, writing notes, my pen pressing hard enough to tear the paper. When he finally finished, I sat back exhausted, but sharper than I had felt in months. So Ben said gently, "What do you want to do?" "I want control," I answered. Starting now, he helped me set up immediate measures. We arranged to change passwords on all online accounts. I added 2-factor authentication to every login. We placed alerts on withdrawals above a certain limit. I instructed him to move all funds from our joint savings into an account solely under my name, a process that would take a few business days, but was completely within my rights. "And what about the credit cards?" Ben asked carefully. My lips tightened. "I want every card closed that is in both our names. I will reopen in mine only. I also want any authorized users removed immediately." He tapped his pen, looking uncomfortable but compliant. "We can start those requests today." By the time I left his office, the city had shifted from morning gray to afternoon light, people bustling down Michigan Avenue with shopping bags and coffee cups. I walked among them with my scarf pulled tight, clutching the folder of documents like armor. My legs were trembling, but inside, I felt something stirring I had not felt in a long time. Control. At home that evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, logging into every account one by one. I reset passwords, created new security questions, and locked down email addresses. I called the bank to confirm the removal of Mia's name from the credit card. The woman on the line told me it might take 24 hours to process. I smiled grimly, imagining Mia swiping her card across the ocean and seeing the transaction decline. For years, I had been told that I was the glue that kept this family together, the one who smoothed over arguments, who paid the extra bills when Daniel was struggling, who filled the freezer with meals so Mia would not have to cook after long days at her shop. Now, all of that generosity felt like a leash they had tightened around my neck. Cutting it loose was painful but exhilarating. I thought about the house as I walked upstairs. The mortgage papers had been paid off long ago with money from my inheritance. The deed I remembered was never changed into joint ownership. Our attorney had said it was easier for taxes to keep it in my name. That decision, made casually 15 years ago, was now my greatest safeguard. This home was mine. In the quiet of my bedroom, I opened my nightstand and pulled out the flight confirmation again. I smoothed the paper flat on the dresser, staring at the names printed so neatly. Tom Miller, Daniel Miller, Mia Carter, the 3 of them side by side, the ones who mattered. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into the drawer. I no longer felt the same stabbing pain I had felt when I first discovered it. Now I felt something colder, steadier. They had their trip. They had their secret. And now I had my plan. That night I sat in bed with my laptop glowing against the dark. I watched as account balances refreshed, new alerts, pinged to my phone, locks clicked into place. Every change was a small act of defiance, a brick in the wall I was building to protect myself. For the first time in months, I fell asleep, not with questions rattling in my mind, but with a sense of resolve pressing down like a heavy, comforting blanket. They had thought I was weak. They had thought I would sit quietly and let them erase me. They had been wrong. I woke early the next morning with a mind that refused to rest, the chill of December seeping through the windows. My coffee grew cold on the table as I sat with my laptop determined to comb through every detail of our accounts. I had locked down the basics, but something told me there was more hidden in the corners, small cracks, where Mia had slipped her hand in without asking. When the credit card dashboard loaded, my stomach clenched. Under Tom's name, listed neatly in small print, was another user, Mia Carter. She had been added as an authorized user 6 months earlier, right around the time she started planting doubts about my memory. I clicked deeper and saw her fingerprints everywhere. Transactions for home decor suppliers, ribbon and packaging companies, online ad charges, all aligned with her little boutique business she had started 2 years ago. I realized with sick clarity that she had been funding her shop with my credit hidden under the umbrella of our marriage. I dialed the number on the back of the card. The representative answered, cheerful and scripted, but I cut her off quickly. I gave my information, recited every verification detail I knew by heart, and asked her to remove an unauthorized user immediately. She asked for the name. I said it flatly, Mia Carter. She asked who had added her. I said my husband, Thomas Miller. There was a pause, then the sound of typing. Within minutes, she confirmed that the removal had been processed, effective immediately. No future transactions would be approved. She gave me a confirmation code, which I scribbled on the back of an envelope. I sat back, letting the words sink in. Effective immediately. I pictured Mia standing at a checkout counter in Madrid, handing over her shiny card with a smile, only for the clerk to frown when the screen flashed decline. I felt the corner of my mouth lift. It was not revenge in my imagination, it was simple justice. The account was mine and she had no right to touch it. Still restless, I moved to another card we had barely used in recent years, one originally opened for travel rewards. When I logged in there, it was again her name, added 3 months ago. This time, I did not waste any time feeling sick. I called the number and asked for removal. The agent explained a new card could be issued in my name only. I agreed, making sure she noted on the account that any change required my explicit approval and a secondary PIN. Another confirmation number, another boundary restored. As I logged out, the realization settled hard in my chest. This had not been an accident or a one-time favor. It had been deliberate, repeated. Tom had signed off on her inclusion, and Mia had taken every inch he gave her and stretched it into miles. She had been draining quietly while I was left wondering why our balances never seemed to hold steady. I had thought it was Tom's golf outings or Daniel's occasional need for help. Now I saw the truth. It was her. Always her. I opened the drawer in the hallway and pulled out a pile of unopened statements Tom had stacked away. I slit them open and laid them flat on the counter. Each page painted the same story. Restaurant tabs with Mia's signature online ads tied to her shop, endless small purchases that looked ordinary if you did not line them up side by side. It was parasitic disguised as normal life. I gripped the counter until my nails dug into the wood. For years, I had been the one who said yes when Daniel asked for help, the one who made sure the bills were paid on time, the one who cut corners so we could afford family vacations. And all the while, Mia was quietly feeding from my accounts, pretending it was owed to her. The shame of not seeing it earlier burned in me, but the anger was stronger. I picked up the phone again and called the bank. The clerk's voice was professional as she confirmed the transfer I had requested yesterday was already in progress. The joint account would be emptied into my individual account within 48 hours. She reassured me that the debit card for that account was mine alone. I thanked her and ended the call, the words, "mine alone," echoing in my mind like a hymn. I walked back to the living room and looked at the stockings still hanging. Without hesitation, I took Mia's down. I folded it and placed it in a drawer with the unused lights and ornament hooks. Not out of rage, but out of order. She no longer belonged in the lineup, not even as a piece of decoration. The afternoon sun streamed weakly through the windows as I sat again at the table, setting new alerts on my accounts. Every charge above $50 would ping my phone. Every login attempt would trigger a text. I changed security questions, making them answers only I would know. The quiet tap of my fingers on the keyboard felt like hammer strikes sealing shut a vault. As dusk fell, I poured myself soup and sat by the window. Snow dusted the yard, covering the swing set Daniel had once played on. I thought of him, my boy, who used to trust me with every secret now reduced to silence, while his wife carved me out of my own family. My chest ached, but my resolve deepened. The phone buzzed once, a fraud alert. My heart skipped until I saw it clearly. A pending charge in Madrid, a breakfast cafe. The hold had slipped through just as the representative warned. It would be the last. I imagined Mia's face at dinner when her card was declined, the entitlement cracking. This was not fantasy. This was math. This was process. This was truth. I finished my soup slowly, each spoonful a reminder that I was no longer waiting for permission to act. I had pulled her hand from my pocket and locked the drawer. For the first time in a long time, the house felt like mine again, and I intended to keep it that way. The morning after I removed Mia from the accounts, I found myself dialing another number I had not used in years. Ms. Evelyn Carter's office line rang twice before her assistant answered and placed me on hold. Within minutes, Evelyn's calm, steady voice came through, the same voice that had guided us through estate planning more than a decade ago. "Grace, it has been a long time. What is going on?" I told her I needed to meet in person and that it was urgent. She told me to come in that afternoon. By 1 o'clock, I was sitting across from her in a quiet conference room, the smell of polished wood and fresh coffee lingering in the air. Evelyn, at 58, carried herself with the authority of someone who had seen every form of family dispute. She leaned back in her chair and listened as I laid out everything from the Christmas trip to Spain to the financial manipulations to the little digs about my memory. When I finished, her expression was tight but controlled. "The good news, Grace, is that most of the assets are in your name. You have significant legal power here, but one thing in particular we need to address is the $20,000 transfer." I nodded, my stomach tightening. I remembered the day Tom slid those papers across the desk and told me it was just an update to the will. I signed without reading carefully, too trusting, too tired. Weeks later, Daniel and Mia showed off a new SUV, and I had wondered how they afforded it. Now I knew. That money had come from me. Evelyn pulled a file closer and wrote quickly, "What we will do is draft a demand letter. It will state clearly that the $20,000 was not a voluntary gift, but obtained through misrepresentation. We will give them 14 days to repay in full or agree to a payment plan, 24 months maximum. If they refuse, we escalate to collections." Her tone was firm, businesslike, but she looked me in the eye when she spoke. "Grace, this is about setting boundaries. They cannot treat your accounts like an open faucet. If you do nothing, they will continue." I swallowed hard and nodded. "Do it." She tapped her pen. "We should also protect you from any narrative they may try to spin about your mental capacity. You mentioned Mia has been suggesting you are forgetful." "Yes. Little things here and there. correcting me in front of Daniel, telling me I was confused when I knew I was not. "That is called gaslighting," Evelyn said plainly. "I recommend scheduling an independent cognitive evaluation. The report will certify you are fully competent. That way, if they ever attempt to claim you are not capable of managing your finances, we already have medical documentation to counter it." The relief that washed over me was sharper than expected. "Thank you, Evelyn. Please arrange it." She smiled gently. "I will refer you to a trusted neuropsychologist. You will meet, take some standardized assessments, and the results will be filed with me. Once we have that, their argument evaporates." She drafted the outline of the demand letter while I sat silently, my hands folded tight in my lap. She read the draft aloud, her voice steady. "To Daniel Miller and Mia Carter, this letter serves as formal notice that the $20,000 transferred from Grace Miller's investment account on June 14th was executed under false pretenses. Repayment in full within 14 days or a signed payment plan. Failure to comply will result in referral to collection and potential civil action." Hearing the words out loud steadied me in a way I had not expected. It was not just anger now, it was structure. It was accountability. It was the law catching up to betrayal. When Evelyn finished, she looked at me closely. "Are you ready for this, Grace?" I took a deep breath. I have been ready since the moment I read that text on Christmas night. She nodded and signed the bottom of the draft. "We will send this certified to their home address tomorrow." I left her office with the winter sun glaring off the icy sidewalks, the air sharp in my lungs. I clutched the copy of the letter in my purse, feeling its weight like a stone. For years, I had been the one who fixed things quietly, who avoided confrontation, who kept the peace. Now I was drawing lines in black ink. Back home, I set the letter on the kitchen table and sat staring at it. My phone buzzed with another fraud alert, another restaurant in Madrid. I let it pass. Soon they would feel the walls closing in. Soon they would realize I was not their silent benefactor anymore. That night before bed, I wrote in my planner, "Call Dr. Patel, schedule evaluation. Follow up with Evelyn about demand letter. Check transfer confirmation from bank." The neat bullet points steadied me. I climbed into bed and switched off the lamp. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt like a fortress I was slowly reinforcing brick by brick, with every phone call, every password change, every legal step. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, knowing tomorrow a certified envelope would be on its way, and with it a message Daniel and Mia could no longer ignore. Driving home from Evelyn's office, another memory began pressing on me with unwelcome weight. It was not recent, but it had been gnawing in the back of my mind for months, and now it demanded attention. 2 years earlier, Mia had come to me with wide eyes and big dreams. She wanted to start an online decor business, Carter Interiors. She said it would be focused on home accents, affordable luxury, and she promised that with a small investment, it could become profitable quickly. I remember Daniel standing beside her nodding as though every word she spoke carried wisdom. I had given her $30,000 from my savings. No contract, no written agreement, no report of how the money would be used. She had called it an opportunity for me to be her silent investor. I had agreed wanting to support her, wanting to believe that she truly wanted me involved. But after handing over the money, I never heard another word about the business. No updates, no financials, not even casual remarks about sales or progress. Whenever I asked, she brushed me off with a vague smile. "We are doing fine, Grace. You do not need to worry about it." Now, with the clarity of betrayal fresh in my veins, I knew I could no longer ignore it. That night, sitting at the kitchen table, I pulled out my laptop and drafted a message. I wrote that as an investor, I needed formal financial statements from Carter Interiors. I wanted an accounting of where the $30,000 had gone. I demanded written documentation within 10 business days. I read the email 3 times before sending it, then sat back with my arms folded tightly against my chest. The next morning, my inbox was empty of any reply, but by evening, Mia had sent a message. It was defensive curt. She said she had been busy traveling and could not possibly pull together documents right away. She claimed the business was going through restructuring, and she suggested my request showed a lack of trust. I almost laughed out loud. Lack of trust. After what she and Tom and Daniel had done over Christmas, she dared to accuse me of distrust. I forwarded the email to Evelyn with a short note. "We need to escalate." Evelyn replied within an hour, advising me to send a certified letter demanding the same information. She reminded me that as an investor, I was entitled to see the books. So the following day, I mailed a formal demand return receipt requested, giving Mia 10 days to provide complete financial records or face legal remedies. Days ticked by in silence. Finally, on the 12th day, a thick envelope arrived at my door. Inside was a haphazard collection of bank statements, invoices, and receipts. I spread them across the dining room table, sorting them into piles. It took only minutes to see the truth. Of the $30,000, less than a quarter had gone to anything resembling business expenses. The rest had bled into personal spending. Department stores, spas, restaurants, plane tickets, even a charge for a luxury handbag boutique. I felt my pulse race as I highlighted line after line. This was not mismanagement. This was theft under the guise of entrepreneurship. I photographed every document and saved digital copies in a folder labeled Carter Interiors Evidence. My hands were shaking, but not from grief. It was adrenaline, righteous and sharp. That evening I called Evelyn. She listened as I summarized the findings, then asked me to drop off the originals. "Bring everything," she said, "and we will prepare for potential litigation." I slid the stack of papers into a manila folder and sealed it like it was evidence for a trial, which in a way it was. Later that night, sitting in the glow of the Christmas tree that still stood in my living room, I thought back to the day I wrote that first check for Mia. I had wanted so badly to be accepted, to be included. She had called me her partner, her silent supporter. I had felt a small flicker of hope that maybe we could build something together. Looking at the documents spread out now, I realized she had never wanted a partner. She had wanted a benefactor, someone to bankroll her while she smiled for appearances and whispered to others that I was losing my mind. I stood and walked to the window, the snow outside glittering under the streetlights. My reflection looked back at me, older, wiser, but not broken. The $30,000 she had taken was not just money. It was proof, undeniable proof, that from the very beginning she had been willing to exploit me. And now I had it in black and white. I turned off the tree lights, carried the folder upstairs, and placed it in the same drawer that held the flight confirmations and hotel receipts. The drawer was filling quickly, a quiet archive of betrayal, but it was also becoming my arsenal. For the first time in years, I felt that I was no longer simply reacting. I was gathering, building, preparing. The house was silent as I climbed into bed, but the silence no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a pause before the next move, a space I had carved for myself. I closed my eyes knowing that in the morning I would walk into Evelyn's office with a folder full of evidence that could no longer be ignored. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that makes every sound in the house echo louder than it should. I had just filed away the envelope of Carter Interior's records, tucking them beside the other pieces of evidence I had collected when the phone on the table lit up. At first, I thought it was another fraud alert, or maybe Evelyn checking in, but the number was strange long with a country code I did not recognize. My stomach tightened. Against my better judgment, I answered. Static filled the line, followed by a voice I knew too well. Mia's words came sharp and frantic, her tone a mixture of outrage and panic. "Grace, what have you done? The hotel won't accept our card. They are threatening to throw us out. We can't even pay for dinner. Do you understand what you've caused?" Her shrillness rang in my ears, but before I could answer, Daniel's voice broke in softer but strained. "Mom, please just talk to us. The bank says our cards are blocked. We don't know what's happening." His words trembled with desperation, like a child caught in a storm he couldn't control. Behind them, Tom's voice rumbled low, trying to soothe. "Calm down, Mia. Let me handle this." Then louder, directed at me. "Grace, this is a mistake. Let's just talk about this calmly." I gripped the phone tighter, pressing it to my ear. My voice came out colder than I thought myself capable of. "A mistake. No, Tom. The mistake was yours. The mistake was leaving me behind on Christmas and thinking I wouldn't find the courage to act." Mia cut back in her fury, rising. "You can't just shut off accounts. You can't leave us stranded in another country like this. We are your family." Family? The word twisted in my chest. Family doesn't lie. Family doesn't gaslight and whisper that I'm losing my memory. Family doesn't drain $30,000 into handbags and restaurants under the guise of business. Family doesn't disappear to Madrid while leaving me sitting alone under a Christmas tree. If that is what you call family, then I don't need it. Daniel's voice cracked, caught between loyalty to his wife and fear for me. "Mom, we just wanted time together. Mia thought the travel would be too much for you and Dad agreed. We didn't mean to hurt you. Mia thought." I repeated the words slowly, letting them cut through the air. Mia thought I was forgetful. Mia thought I should stay home. Mia thought she could use my accounts like they were hers. And you, Daniel, you let her do it. You stood by her side while she carved me out of my own life. Silence pressed on the line. I could hear muffled sounds in the background, the clinking of glasses, voices raised in Spanish. Then Tom tried again, calm, persuasive. "Grace, listen to me. We are coming home soon. Let's just sit down like we always have as husband and wife and figure this out. Marriage is about compromise." I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. Compromise. I compromised for 43 years. Every golf trip, every dinner, every time I bailed out Daniel's bills. Every time I ignored Mia's insults to keep peace at the table. That was compromise. What you did wasn't compromise. It was betrayal. Mia's composure cracked. Her voice rose high-pitched and venomous. "You bitter old woman. Do you realize you are destroying everything? You're tearing this family apart." My answer came slow and steady, colder than hers could ever be. "No, Mia. I am saving myself. You destroyed this family the moment you decided I was disposable." Daniel's breathing came through heavy on the line, followed by a tremble in his voice. "Mom, please, we have no money. The hotel is demanding payment. We can't even buy food. We don't know what to do." His words, once capable of piercing my heart, now sounded hollow, worn down by his choices. I lowered my voice, each syllable measured. "You left me alone on Christmas. You erased me from your lives. Now I answer with my own $1.2 million in assets. I will not fund my own erasure." The silence that followed was almost deafening. I imagined their faces pale and frantic in a Madrid hotel lobby surrounded by strangers who didn't care about their excuses. I heard Mia's breath catch, then nothing. I didn't wait for more. With one firm press of my finger, I ended the call. The kitchen sank back into silence. I placed the phone gently on the table, my hand trembling, but steadying quickly. The quiet no longer pressed down on me. It felt lighter, as if I had finally opened a window in a suffocating room. For the first time in months, I breathed deeply, the air filling my lungs without the weight of their lies pressing on me. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the reflection of the streetlight in the window. My house, my accounts, my life. The walls that had once felt like a cage now felt like a fortress. Somewhere across the ocean they were scrambling, arguing, realizing they had lost control of the strings they thought they held. And here in the stillness of my own kitchen I felt the shift. The balance of power was mine again. I poured myself a glass of water and sipped slowly, each swallow grounding me more. Their voices still rang in my ears, but instead of leaving wounds, they now left proof. Proof that I had been right to take action, proof that their anger came not from love, but from losing access to what was never theirs to begin with. When I finally climbed the stairs to bed, the house creaked under my steps, but the sound comforted me. It was my house, my space, my life. I slid beneath the covers, letting the silence wrap around me. For months, sleep had been restless, broken by doubts and whispered words that I replayed endlessly. That night, with the echoes of their fury still fresh, I slept soundly. Not because the storm had passed, but because I knew I was no longer standing in the rain without shelter. The first week of January crept in with a cold wind that rattled the windows and carried with it a storm I had been bracing for since Christmas night. I knew they would come back eventually, dragging their suitcases and their excuses into my house as though nothing had changed. I had rehearsed the moment in my head so many times that when the sound of the front door unlocking finally echoed through the hallway, I felt almost calm. The shuffle of luggage wheels scraped against the hardwood, voices low and tense. I stayed where I was in the kitchen, standing behind the counter where I had laid out every piece of proof. The bank statements that showed the accounts stripped of their access, the deed to the house, with only my name, the bank's letter confirming the closures. Black and white, undeniable, waiting like silent witnesses. Tom entered first, his face lined and weary from travel, his usual self-assurance replaced by caution. Daniel followed, his eyes darting everywhere but toward me. Mia pushed past them both, her chin raised, anger written across her face. The three of them stopped short when they saw the papers spread neatly in front of me. I didn't invite them to sit. I didn't offer coffee or pleasantries. I let the silence fill the kitchen, let them feel the weight of it. Finally, I slid the top page forward, my voice steady and sharp. "This is the joint account you used in Madrid. It's gone. Closed. Every dollar moved." Mia's lips parted, her eyes narrowing. "You can't just do that." I ignored her and tapped the second document. "The deed to this house. Paid for with my inheritance held in my name only. This is mine. Not yours, not ours. Mine." Tom's shoulders shifted as he tried to steady his tone. "Grace, we don't have to do this in such a dramatic way. We can talk." I cut him off. "No, Tom. We can't just talk. Talking is what you stopped doing when you planned a trip without me." My gaze shifted to Daniel, and the words I had been holding for weeks finally found their way out. Who sent the message on Christmas? The one that said only the ones who matter. Daniel's throat worked, but he didn't speak. He looked at Mia, then at the floor. It was Mia who answered, her voice sharp and defiant. I sent it. Because it's true. We wanted a Christmas without the guilt, without your constant control. The words sliced clean through me, but I stood tall. Thank you for admitting it. You excluded me. You lied to me. You used me. Daniel finally spoke, his voice breaking. Mom, I didn't mean for it to, but you did. I said, my eyes locking on his. You let her speak for you, spend for you, decide for you. You let her erase me from my own family. The room went quiet again, thick with the sound of the refrigerator's hum and the slow tick of the wall clock. I slid the bank's confirmation letter forward, my voice low and final. From now on, every cent is under my control. Every account is in my name. You will not spend another dollar of mine. Tom leaned forward, his voice rising with urgency. Grace, we've been married 43 years. We've always shared. I shook my head, my hand flat on the folder of documents. No. I shared. You took. And you let her take. Mia let out a bitter laugh, her voice dripping with contempt. Do you really think you can cut us off and pretend we're not family? Family. I repeated slowly, the word hollow in my mouth. Family doesn't abandon me on Christmas. Family doesn't trick me into signing away $20,000. Family doesn't gaslight me until I question my own memory. Daniel's voice trembled, almost a whisper. Mom, please, it's not like that. I turned my eyes on him, steady and unwavering. Daniel, it is exactly like that. You let her decide everything. You let her voice replace yours. You let her paint me as weak and confused. He swallowed hard, his face pale, and looked away. Tom tried again, softer now. Grace, maybe we need counseling. Mediation. We can find a way forward. I gathered the papers into one pile, each sheet sliding against the next. This is the way forward. The only way left. You forced me here. Mia's mask cracked, then her voice rising into a near shout. You're pathetic, bitter and jealous because we've built a life without needing you. I met her fury with calm steel. I don't want to control your life, Mia. I want control of mine, my life, my money, and you will never touch it again. The words landed heavy, each one final and immovable. They had no answer. Tom's eyes flicked away, Daniel's shoulders hunched lower, and Mia's glare burned, but faltered under the weight of the truth. I placed the papers back into their folder and held it close to my chest. The evidence was there, undeniable, and so was my decision. The kitchen hung heavy with silence as I looked at each of them, the people who had once been my family, and realized that for the first time in decades, I was not the one on trial. They were. I walked past them slowly, the folder tight in my grip, leaving the papers, but not my power, behind. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no going back. The days after that confrontation were heavy with silence. They left my kitchen without another word, but I knew the battle was far from over. It didn't take long for the whispers to begin. I noticed it first at the grocery store when a neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, greeted me with an odd look. Later that week, Joan, my friend from the church group, called to tell me she had overheard Mia at the community center, claiming I had become controlling, that I was trying to dictate Daniel's life, that I had cut them off financially out of spite. I listened quietly as Joan repeated the story, and though anger pricked at me, I stayed calm. The truth always has a way of surfacing, and soon it did. 2 evenings later, while taking out the trash, I ran into Frank the doorman, who often worked security at neighborhood events. He leaned against the brick wall, cigarette in hand, and shook his head. Grace, I don't know what your daughter-in-law thinks she's doing, but she's making a fool of herself. What do you mean, Frank? I asked. He told me about a holiday gala at the community hall, how Mia had brushed him off weeks earlier when he asked whether to invite me. She had laughed and said, "Don't bother calling Grace, she isn't needed." Now Frank said people remembered that and connected it with the story about them being stranded in Madrid when their credit cards were declined. Word had spread quickly that I had taken back control of my finances. People were not mocking me, they were mocking them. It was almost comical how quickly Mia's attempt at painting me as overbearing backfired. At the post office, I overheard 2 women whispering about how humiliating it must have been for them stuck overseas without access to money. At church, when Tom tried to sit beside me, a few of the congregation members gave him looks so sharp that he left after the first hymn. Daniel was not spared either. A colleague of his, a neighbor whose son worked at the same school, asked me outright one morning if it was true Daniel had begged me for money after using mine to buy a new SUV. The heat rose in my face, but I did not deny it. I simply said, "Ask him yourself." By the following week, Daniel was avoiding the local coffee shop, entirely embarrassed by the stares. For me, it was a strange reversal. For so long, I had been the one made to feel small, questioned and diminished. Now it was Mia who shrank under the weight of whispers. Every glance at the grocery store, every hushed laugh behind her back, chipped away at the image she tried so hard to uphold. I saw her once at the pharmacy. She spotted me across the aisle, froze, and then quickly turned away, her cheeks red. I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered her words on Christmas, "Only the ones who matter." That memory hardened me again. Tom tried to weather the storm by staying out of sight. He spent most of his time at Daniel's house, though I heard from Joan that even there the tension was unbearable. The neighbors had noticed raised voices through the thin walls. Some said Tom looked older, more fragile, as if the weight of his choices was finally pressing on him. Meanwhile, my world began to open again. At the library book club, women who had once been quiet toward me now leaned closer, asking gentle questions. One said she admired me for standing up for myself. Another confided that her own son's wife often tried to push her aside, and she wished she had my courage. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. The shift was not just social, but emotional. Walking down Main Street, I no longer lowered my head. I carried my shoulders higher, my steps firmer. The town had seen what happened in Madrid. They had heard the stories of credit cards declined and hotel staff threatening to call the police. And they had heard that it was because I had taken back control. Mia must have realized it too, because her campaign grew more desperate. She tried to post online painting me as senile, claiming I was paranoid. But the posts were met with skepticism, some even with ridicule. One neighbor replied publicly, reminding her of the very words she had said about me months ago, mocking my memory at Thanksgiving. Another mentioned how odd it was that someone supposedly forgetful had managed to untangle accounts and secure legal counsel so efficiently. I didn't have to defend myself. The community did it for me. And with each passing day, Mia's voice grew smaller, her credibility crumbling. Daniel kept his distance, but I could feel his shame mounting. When I spotted him at the grocery store one Saturday, he gave me a quick nod, his face pale, then hurried down another aisle. He looked thinner, the weight of responsibility pressing harder now that the financial support he had counted on was gone. And Tom, once the man who carried himself with certainty, avoided even eye contact when our paths crossed. He no longer spoke of compromise or mediation. Instead, he seemed to drift unsure where to stand as the walls of his choices closed in around him. For me, the quiet in my home no longer felt lonely. It felt protective, safe. The whispers outside were no longer about me being irrelevant. They were about Mia, about Tom, about Daniel. Their lies had unraveled, exposed by their own arrogance. One evening, as I sat by the window sipping tea and watching the snow fall, Joan called again. "Grace, you should know something," she said, her voice tinged with both amusement and satisfaction. At the New Year's gathering, Mia tried to tell her version again that you were controlling, that poor Daniel was caught in the middle. But before she could finish, Frank interrupted and told everyone about Madrid, about the cards being declined, about how she had dismissed you at the gala. The whole room went quiet, then someone laughed. And that was it. I closed my eyes and smiled, faintly picturing it. For so long I had feared isolation, feared being erased from the very community I had lived in for decades. But in the end, it was not me who was erased. It was Mia undone by her own cruelty and greed. The backlash spread like a quiet tide, reshaping the ground beneath us all. And for the first time, I felt the weight lift. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. It was out there, undeniable, and the world around me had chosen to see it. The cold of January had settled deep into the streets of Evanston when I decided it was time to face Daniel on my own terms. I called him on a Tuesday evening and asked him to meet me at a quiet diner near Lake Street, the same one where we used to share milkshakes after his high school games. He arrived bundled in a heavy coat, his face thinner, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He slid into the booth across from me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The waitress poured coffee, and only when she left did I finally break the silence. "You chose to believe Mia instead of speaking to me directly," I said, my voice low but firm. "That wasn't her fault. That was yours." Daniel's hands tightened around the mug, his knuckles pale. "Mom, I know. I let her speak for me because it was easier. She told me you were getting confused, that you were forgetful, and I didn't question it. I let her make me believe you were slipping." His voice cracked. "I should have come to you." The weight of his admission pressed heavy between us. I studied him, searching for the boy I once held when he was small, and certain that I would always protect him. That boy seemed far away now. "Sorry isn't enough, Daniel. You don't get to wipe away years of disrespect with a single word. If you want me in your life, if you want a real relationship, you will need to prove it through action." His eyes lifted, finally, glassy with shame. "I will. I swear I will, Mom." I nodded, but didn't let him off the hook. "We'll see. Words are easy. I need to see that you mean them." He looked as though he wanted to say more, but I slid out of the booth before he could. Leaving him sitting there hunched over his coffee was one of the hardest things I had ever done. But I knew if I stayed, I would soften. And this was not a moment for softness. The harder conversation came with Tom. I asked him to meet me at the house, my house, the one he had lived in for decades, but had never truly owned. He walked in slowly, his shoulders stooped under his winter coat, his eyes darting toward the table where I had already laid out the divorce paperwork. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where we had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where I had once believed we were a team. I am filing for divorce, I said simply. The process will take a few months, but I have already spoken with my lawyer. Tom's face fell. After 43 years, you're just ending it like this. I kept my voice steady. You ended it when you chose to deceive me. You ended it when you flew across the ocean with our son and his wife and left me to eat Christmas dinner alone. You ended it the moment you started treating me like I was a burden to be managed, not a partner. He rubbed his hands together, his voice weak. What happens to me? You'll have your pension, I answered. You'll get whatever the court says is legally yours. But the house is mine, bought with my inheritance. The bulk of the accounts are mine. You'll walk away with far less than you thought because that's the reality of what you brought into this marriage. He looked down, his lips pressed tight, and for the first time in years, I saw something I had never expected in him. Defeat. The news did not stay private for long. Mia reacted with her usual fire, storming into the yard one evening, her coat hanging open, her hair wild in the wind. You can't do this, she shouted loud enough for the neighbors to hear through their windows. You can't just cut us off like we're trash. I stepped out onto the porch, my arms crossed against the cold. I already have. Your business is gone, Mia. The $30,000 you drained was the last you'll see from me. You'll get no more checks, no more bailouts, no more quiet rescues. Her face contorted, her voice rising higher. Daniel needs me. He needs stability. Daniel needs to learn to stand on his own 2 feet, I answered. And he won't do it by leaning on my money. She sputtered, searching for words before resorting to insults I had heard before. Bitter old woman, jealous, controlling. None of them landed. Daniel appeared on the sidewalk, his face pale as he grabbed her arm and pulled her back. He didn't look at me, but I saw the shame carved into his posture. Inside, I closed the door and leaned against it, listening, as her voice carried down the street, the neighbors no doubt peering through curtains again. The woman who had once strutted proudly in this neighborhood now looked desperate, cornered, and stripped of the image she had built. That night, I sat at the kitchen table alone, staring at the divorce papers. My hand hovered over the pen, not to sign just yet, but to feel its weight. I thought of the decades I had spent being the quiet provider, the one who always had the check ready, the one who fixed every problem. I thought of the birthdays, where I funded the gifts but never received gratitude, the holidays, where my labor filled the table but my name was barely mentioned in the toasts. I realized then that the pattern was broken. I had drawn the line. I was no longer the one who fed everyone else while starving my own heart. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace wash over me, not because the battles were finished, but because I had chosen myself. The courts would take their time, the lawyers would draft their letters, Mia would continue to rage, Daniel would wrestle with guilt, and Tom would shrink into his own silence. But none of that changed the truth. The truth was that I was done being their safety net. I was done being erased. I was Grace Miller, and I was finally free to live without carrying the weight of 3 people who had never valued me as they should have. The rhythm of my days shifted quickly once I stepped away from being the provider everyone else had relied on. By summer, I was waking in Florence in a small apartment with green shutters that looked down on a cobbled lane where scooters buzzed and vendors stacked tomatoes in neat red pyramids. The apartment belonged to Elena Rossi, a widow a few years younger than me who welcomed me like a sister. She showed me how to work the stubborn stove and introduced me to the neighbors who left baskets of figs outside the door when the season was ripe. In those first weeks, I joined a cooking class led by a cheerful chef named Marco. He guided us through the art of kneading dough until it was silky and taught us that a sauce should never hurry, only whisper at the edges of the pan. My hands, which had once written checks and signed forms to keep a family afloat, now folded ravioli and rolled biscotti. I laughed more than I had in years. Flour streaked across my sweater wine poured freely at the end of each lesson. On quiet mornings, I wandered museums without glancing at the clock. I stood before Botticelli's Primavera until my neck ached, and I lingered at the Duomo steps as students sketched lines I could barely trace with my eyes. I felt small in the best way, part of a long story that belonged to the city rather than to betrayal. Back in Chicago, the divorce had moved through the courts. My attorney Evelyn kept me updated with steady calls. The decree was final by spring. Tom received his pension and a portion the law required, but the house and the majority of the accounts were confirmed as mine. I heard he had taken a modest rental near Ridge Avenue, a one-bedroom that smelled of radiator heat and old linoleum. The life of dinners at steakhouses and spontaneous weekends was gone. I imagined him eating takeout alone, and instead of anger, I felt only distance. Mia's world collapsed faster. Carter Interiors filed dissolution papers in March. The bank account drained, the website shut down. I had once given her $30,000 in good faith, hoping to see her grow something lasting. The records proved she spent most of it on handbags, travel, and photo shoots rather than inventory. By the time the truth spread, no one believed her claims about me anymore. She vanished for a time, staying with relatives in Wisconsin. I did not ask for updates. Daniel's calls began hesitantly. The first came in April, his voice unsteady. He asked if I was safe in Italy, if I would forgive him. I listened, but gave no comfort beyond honesty. Apologies were not enough. He would have to show me he meant it. He promised he would, and I hung up with no promises in return. Weeks later, he called again. He told me he had left the house he shared with Mia and rented a small place of his own. He said he had sold the SUV I unknowingly paid for and bought an old Honda outright. He admitted he was ashamed each time he faced colleagues who asked about Madrid. This time he did not ask for forgiveness. He only said he wanted me to know he was trying. In May, an envelope arrived in Evelyn's office. Inside was a money order from Daniel, the first repayment on the $20,000. It was only $500, but it was real. A second payment followed the next month. I kept photocopies in a folder labeled not debts, but rebuilding. Meanwhile, Florence taught me to breathe differently. Elena invited me to her terrace in the evenings, where we shared olives and small glasses of Chianti as church bells rolled over the rooftops. She told me stories of her late husband and how she learned to plant basil in recycled wine crates. I told her about my years of invisibility, and she listened without judgment. Sometimes we sat in silence, and that silence healed me more than words. By June, Daniel called from a park where children shouted in the background. He told me he had begun counseling recommended by his school district to untangle his dependence on others. He said he cooked dinner for himself most nights, and even invited a colleague over for spaghetti. He did not ask if I was proud. He only said he wanted me to know. I answered carefully, "Keep showing me. Keep proving it." That night, I walked along the Arno as twilight painted the water rose and violet. I thought of the Christmas Eve I had spent alone staring at blinking lights and wondering if I had become irrelevant. I thought of the phone call from Madrid, their voices frantic, their cards declined. I thought of the moment I locked every account and felt the power shift back into my own hands. They had believed I was powerless. They had mistaken silence for weakness. But justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is a series of signed forms, a locked account, a refusal to open the door to more lies. One evening, Elena and I attended a neighborhood festival. Children spun in circles, older women sang, and an old man showed me how to twist dough into rings before dropping them into oil. As the music rose, I felt something inside me loosen. Survival was not only about shutting doors, it was also about opening windows. I wrote postcards to Joan and Mrs. Jenkins, and even to Frank the doorman, telling them about peaches that tasted like summer itself and evenings filled with violin music. I did not write to Tom. His story no longer intersected with mine. On my final week in June, I stood on Elena's balcony, the cathedral dome rising dark against the sky. A violinist played scales nearby, and a couple argued gently in the street. I held my phone in my hand, reading Daniel's latest text. He had made another repayment. He had brought coffee to the custodian who covered his extra shift. He wrote nothing more, and that was enough. Ordinary life carried by his own effort. I typed back 3 words. "Keep going, Daniel." They once thought I did not matter. When they left me on Christmas, I answered with the strength of $1.2 million in assets and the courage to live without them. Justice did not need shouting. It needed boundaries, patience, and resolve. Now I ask you, if you had been in my place, would you forgive a son who shows remorse in action and not only words? Would you open the door again, or would you close it for good? Tell me what you think, because I am still learning how to choose myself while deciding how much of my heart to keep open.